Welcome back to your beginner watercolor journey. In lesson 1, we talked about supplies and why having quality supplies matters. We even completed a fun project at the end. For this lesson, you're welcome to use any supplies you have on hand, but everything I'm using is linked below. Your supplies will affect your results, so keep that in mind. Today we're focusing on one of the most important watercolor skills, water control. Watercolor is all about balance. Too much water and your paint will be much harder to control, especially as a beginner. You can see how the water is pooling in the right side of the paper here. And as I spread out the water, it helps to bring some of that control back. If you have too little water, your watercolors won't flow, so finding that balance is important. In this video, I'll show you 5 fundamental techniques that will help you master water control. Then we'll put it all together in a fun and easy mini watercolor landscape painting. Let's get started. First, let's talk about wet on wet versus wet on dry. These two techniques are the foundation of watercolor painting. With wet on wet, we start by wetting the paper with clean water. Then we drop in color and watch it flow. This creates soft blends that are perfect for skies and backgrounds. Or when I'm working on a pet portrait, I will often start with this technique to lay down the foundation of soft fur, or when I'm mapping out shadows and tones. If you want, you can even drop in other colors and watch how they blend together on the paper. It will create what we call a bloom of color. For wet on dry, we paint directly onto dry paper with your wet paint. So start by wetting your brush and dabbing off any excess water, then grab some wet paint onto the brush before brushing it across the paper. And you don't want your brush dripping wet with this technique. Pause the video and practice both. Try making a wet on wet wash and watch how the colors bloom. Then make a wet on dry stroke and notice how the edges stay crisp. Next up is dry brushing. This technique is great for adding texture like grass, fur, or wood grain. Instead of loading your brush with lots of water, we'll dab off the excess and use just a little bit of paint to create a more scratchy texture. Now lightly drag your brush up in a quick motion to create a textured grass. See how it leaves a rough, broken texture? This is dry brushing. Try this technique with different brush angles to see how the effect changes. Watercolor is more forgiving than you might think. You can lift color even after it dries. There are 2 ways to lift color. So the first one is while the paint is still wet, you can take a damp brush and gently lift some of the color. This works well for creating clouds, highlights, or soft effects. For lifting paint after it dries, you use a clean, damp brush or a tissue to gently blot away some of the paint. This is great for making an area lighter or even fixing mistakes. Go ahead and pause the video and practice. Try painting a dark wash, then lift out some highlights using a tissue or brush. Soft edges help blend areas together, making watercolor look natural and smooth. So here's how to do it. You paint a bold stroke on dry paper, and then while it's still damp, use a clean, wet brush to gently soften one side. Watch how the color fades into the paper. Soft edges are great for shadows, clouds, and natural textures. Try practicing this with different colors. Unlike other paints, watercolor works from light to dark. We don't use white paint, we save the white of the paper instead. So here's how layering works. You paint a light first layer and let it dry fully. After it has dried completely, you'll add a second darker layer on top. Each layer adds more depth, and it's helpful when it comes to shading and dimension or adding detail. Try layering different colors and see how they interact. That brings us to our final project for lesson 2, a mini landscape painting. Go ahead and pause the video and grab your supplies. Everything I'm using for this project is linked below, but feel free to use the supplies you have on hand. Grab your artist tape and a 5" by 7" piece of watercolor paper. I'm using 100% cotton, 140-pound paper from a block that I've cut down to size. For the sky, we're using our wet on wet technique. So wet your brush and smooth it across the top 2/3 of your paper, leaving the bottom third dry. If you're using good quality paper, your paper shouldn't buckle and bend. Then grab some of your ultramarine blue paint and drop it into the wet area. You want to kind of smooth it around, but it's okay if it looks a little messy. That'll make it look more natural. Next, grab a crumpled up piece of paper towel and gently dab some areas of the blue paint to give it a soft cloud effect. Let this dry completely before you move on to the next step. Now that your sky has dried completely, we're going to switch to our size 10 round brush for the rest of the project. Go ahead and get your Payne's Gray ready and double check that your sky is completely dry. Using your Payne's Gray, you're going to draw a very rough outline of some mountains across your paper. Try to resist the urge to make this look perfect. You'll need to work quickly on this step so the paint stays wet for the next part. Then clean off your brush and take your damp brush and rub it back and forth along the bottom part of your mountain outline. This is going to bring that line or that color down a little bit, and it'll also soften that line. Then you can go back and drop in more gray along the top if you need to make it a little darker. Since your paint is still wet, it will just bleed out into soft shadows. Now I'm just gently smoothing out the bottom and dropping in a little more color in some areas. Let this dry completely before moving on. Now that it's dry, we can add in the closer mountain range the same way we did with the back ones. Draw a very rough outline, trying not to follow the same pattern as the first set. Then go in with your damp brush and smooth out that bottom line. Since these mountains are closer, we want them to be a little darker than the back ones. So drop in more color across the top and throughout to give them some texture and dimension. For this step, it's okay if your paint is still a little damp, but you don't want it completely wet. I'm using a lighter yellow-green for this part. Grab some paint and run it across the underside of the mountains. Then take a damp brush and smooth out the bottom. Then using a darker green, very roughly add that to the bottom section of the yellow green that you just painted. If you work quickly, your paint will still be wet and everything should blend together nicely. Then you can drop in some of the yellow green into the wet paint to create some texture. You can even take some of the Payne's gray that you used on the mountains and drop some in towards the bottom to create some subtle shadows and texture. Allow your painting to dry completely before moving on to the final step. Now that your painting is dry, you can carefully remove the tape from the edges. If you're using high quality paper, the tape should not tear, but work slowly just in case. Using a waterproof pen, you can sign your painting and add a few birds off in the distance if you want. And there you have it, your first mini watercolor landscape. This project helped us practice water control, layering, and soft edges. Keep experimenting with these techniques, and in the next lesson, we'll learn about color mixing and even create another fun project. See you next time.